Deep in the remote hill country of central Texas, in a region where families lived miles apart and the nearest law was a 3-day ride away, a traveling physician named Dr. Samuel Hayes documented something in his journal that would haunt him until his death 30 years later. Between March and August of 1854, he was called to an isolated homestead where 7 young women, all sisters ranging in age from 15 to 28, were simultaneously expecting children. The family patriarch insisted it was God's will. The county sheriff, when he finally learned of the situation, found records deliberately destroyed and witnesses too terrified to speak. For decades, the official explanation remained a private family matter. But the truth, buried in courthouse documents that survived a suspicious fire in 1867, reveals a nightmare that challenges everything we understand about justice, silence, and survival in frontier Texas. Before we continue with the story of the Hargrove family and what really happened on that isolated ranch in Blanco County, I want to ask you something important. If you're interested in true historical mysteries that have been hidden for generations, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Your engagement helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. Now let's discover what Dr. Hayes found when he arrived at the Hargrove Ranch on that humid March morning in 1854. What the doctor witnessed that day would set in motion an investigation that exposed not just one family's terrible secret, but the dangerous isolation that allowed such horrors to remain hidden in the vast Texas frontier. Blanco County in 1854 was barely civilized by any measure. Texas had been a state for less than a decade, and much of the central hill country remained a patchwork of scattered homesteads, each family carving out survival from limestone soil and endless prairie. The county seat, Johnson City, wouldn't even be founded for another quarter century. Families lived in profound isolation. The nearest neighbor might be 5 or 10 miles away, accessible only by rough trails that became impassable during the frequent rains. The Hargrove family had settled their ranch in 1847, claiming nearly 800 acres along a bend in the Pedernales River. Josiah Hargrove, the patriarch, had come to Texas from Tennessee with his wife Martha and their growing brood of daughters. By all accounts, he was a stern man, deeply religious in the manner common to frontier families, and fiercely protective of what he called family privacy. His nearest neighbors, the Drummond family, lived 6 miles to the east and saw the Hargroves perhaps twice a year at most. Martha Hargrove had died in childbirth in 1849, delivering her 8th daughter, who survived only 3 days. This left Josiah alone to raise 7 girls. Ruth, the eldest, at 28 in 1854, Naomi, 26, Judith, 23, Esther, 21, Deborah, 19, Mary, 17, and Sarah, just 15. The family rarely came to town, and when they did, it was Josiah alone, purchasing supplies with the few dollars earned from selling cattle. The daughters were never seen. Those who encountered Josiah described him as a tall, gaunt man, with piercing eyes and a manner of speaking that made even simple conversation feel like a sermon. He quoted scripture constantly, and seemed to view the world beyond his property with deep suspicion. The righteous need not explain themselves to the unrighteous, he once told a merchant in Fredericksburg who asked about his family's well-being. The isolation of the Hargrove Ranch was extreme even by frontier standards. The property lay at the end of a wagon trail that wound through dense cedar and live oak, crossing 3 separate creek beds that flooded regularly. During winter months, the ranch could be completely cut off from civilization for weeks at a time. There was no school within 20 miles, no church closer than the small Lutheran congregation in Fredericksburg, 30 miles away. The Hargrove daughters grew up knowing almost nothing of the world beyond their father's property. Dr. Samuel Hayes had established his practice in Fredericksburg in 1852, one of only 3 physicians serving an area of several hundred square miles. At 42, he was an educated man, trained in Philadelphia before the lure of the frontier brought him west. His journal, preserved by his descendants and now held in the Texas State Archives, provides the only detailed account of what he found at the Hargrove Ranch. The summons came on March 12, 1854. A young Mexican ranch hand named Diego Fuentes arrived at Dr. Hayes's office just after dawn, his horse lathered from hard riding. He carried a note written in a careful, educated hand. Dr. Hayes, your services required urgently. Medical matter of delicate nature. Josiah Hargrove, Pedernales Ranch. The note included rough directions and a promise of payment. Dr. Hayes gathered his medical bag and rode out that same morning. The journey took nearly 7 hours, the trail exactly as difficult as frontier residents described. As he approached the Hargrove property, Hayes noted in his journal the increasing sense of isolation. Past no dwelling for the final 3 hours. The land here is beautiful but oppressive in its emptiness. One could scream for days and never be heard. The Hargrove Ranch itself was more substantial than Hayes expected. The main house was a sturdy limestone structure, 2 stories with a wide porch, surrounded by several outbuildings including a barn, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a separate sleeping quarters. But something struck Hayes as wrong immediately. Windows shuttered despite the warm day. No sound of voices or activity, though it was mid-afternoon. An eerie silence that made my horse nervous. Josiah Hargrove met him at the door, and their first conversation set the tone for everything that followed. "You've taken a sacred oath, Dr. Hayes," Josiah said, his voice low and intense. "What you see here remains private. God's business is not the world's business." Hayes, accustomed to the eccentric nature of frontier families, agreed, assuming he was being called to attend to a difficult childbirth or perhaps a female ailment that modesty demanded be kept confidential. Nothing could have prepared him for what he found inside. The interior of the house was dim, shutters closed against the daylight. As Hayes's eyes adjusted, he noticed details that troubled him. The house was immaculately clean, but strangely quiet, no sound of conversation or daily life. Josiah led him upstairs to a large room that had clearly been converted into a communal sleeping area. 7 beds lined the walls, and in each bed lay a young woman. "My daughters," Josiah said simply. "All are with child. You will examine them and ensure they are healthy." Hayes stood frozen, his medical training struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. 7 sisters, all visibly pregnant, all in various stages, but each clearly several months along. The implications were impossible to ignore, yet Josiah's manner suggested this was entirely ordinary. The doctor examined each daughter in turn, his journal entries reflecting his growing horror and confusion. Ruth, the eldest, was perhaps 6 months along, calm and resigned. Naomi, 5 months with signs of malnutrition. Judith and Esther, both approximately 4 months pregnant, showed signs of exhaustion. The 3 youngest, Deborah, Mary, and Sarah, were in earlier stages, between 2 and 3 months, and it was these youngest who most concerned Hayes. Sarah, barely 15, would not meet his eyes during the examination. What struck Hayes most profoundly was the daughters' behavior. They did not speak unless Josiah gave permission. They answered Hayes's questions with single words. They showed no surprise at their collective condition, no sign that anything unusual was occurring. It was as if they had been trained to accept this nightmare as normal. Hayes wrote, "I have never seen such complete submission, such absolute absence of will." During the examinations, Hayes tried to ask careful questions. Who was the father? Where were the husbands? The daughters looked to Josiah before answering, and Josiah's response was chilling in its simplicity. "The Lord provides. These children are blessings. You need concern yourself only with their physical health, doctor." Hayes's medical assessment was that all 7 pregnancies appeared to be progressing, though several of the women showed signs of poor nutrition and emotional distress. He provided what care he could, recommending rest, proper diet, prenatal herbs, but his mind was reeling with the obvious question he could not bring himself to ask directly. As he prepared to leave, Josiah walked him to his horse. The conversation that followed, recorded verbatim in Hayes's journal, reveals the patriarch's disturbing worldview. You may think you understand what you've seen today, Doctor, but you're a man of the world, tainted by modern ideas. I live by older laws, biblical laws. My daughters are my responsibility, given to me by God. What happens in my house is between me and the Almighty. Hayes rode away as the sun set, his thoughts in turmoil. Texas law in 1854 was unclear on many matters of family governance. A father's authority over his household was considered nearly absolute, especially in remote areas where legal oversight was minimal. But what Hayes suspected, what he couldn't quite bring himself to fully acknowledge, seemed to transcend even the loosest interpretation of parental authority. That night, back in Fredericksburg, Hayes debated with himself about what action, if any, he should take. His physician's oath demanded confidentiality. The Frontier Code emphasized non-interference in family matters, yet surely what he had witnessed demanded some response. He decided to confide in Father Klaus Brandt, the Lutheran minister, describing what he'd seen without initially naming the family. Father Brandt's response was cautious, but troubled. In the old country, we would call the authorities immediately. But here, Dr. Hayes, you know as well as I that the law barely reaches these remote areas. And without direct testimony from the daughters themselves, what can be proven? If they claim the father of their children is someone else, or multiple someones, who will contradict them. The two men discussed the situation for hours, ultimately deciding that Hayes should report the matter to Sheriff William Prescott, the county's elected lawman who operated out of a small office in Fredericksburg. But Prescott, when approached, proved less than enthusiastic about investigating. "Doc, you're new to Texas," Prescott said, leaning back in his chair. "Out here, a man's home is his castle. Unless one of those girls comes to me directly and makes an accusation, I got no cause to ride out there. Josiah Hargrove is a citizen in good standing, pays his taxes, causes no trouble. If his daughters are pregnant, well, that's unfortunate but not criminal unless someone files a complaint." Hayes pressed the issue. "Sheriff, surely the circumstances suggest—" "They suggest a lot of things, Doctor," Prescott interrupted. "But suggestion ain't evidence. You bring me a sworn statement from one of those girls, or witnesses to an actual crime, and I'll act. Until then, my hands are tied." It was a response that reflected the harsh reality of frontier justice. Without a formal complaint, without witnesses willing to testify, the law was essentially powerless. The isolation that made the Hargrove Ranch a haven for secrets also made it nearly impossible to pierce those secrets with legal action. Hayes left the sheriff's office frustrated and deeply troubled, but he would soon learn that his visit to the Hargrove Ranch had set events in motion that neither he nor Josiah Hargrove could control. In the weeks following Dr. Hayes's visit, whispers began to spread through the scattered community of Central Texas. Hayes had maintained medical confidentiality by not revealing the family's name to most people. But in a region where everyone knew everyone, it didn't take long for speculation to focus on the Hargroves. The family's long isolation, their rare appearances in town, and Josiah's notorious peculiarity made them an obvious subject of rumor. The first crack in the wall of silence came from an unexpected source: Diego Fuentes, the ranch hand who had summoned Dr. Hayes. Fuentes was not actually employed by Josiah Hargrove. He worked for the Drummond family 6 miles away. He had been sent to fetch the doctor by someone else, someone who had paid him generously and sworn him to secrecy about her identity. In late April, nearly 6 weeks after Hayes's visit, Fuentes appeared at the doctor's office again, this time with a letter. "I was paid to give this to you if you came when summoned," he explained. "I was told to wait 1 month, then deliver this. The lady said you would understand." The letter was unsigned, but clearly written by an educated woman. The handwriting was shaky, suggesting it had been composed in haste or under stress. "Dr. Hayes, if you are reading this, I have succeeded in bringing you here, and you have seen what no outsider has witnessed. I am the eldest. I write this in secret, knowing that discovery would mean punishment. We are not free to speak. He watches always. But I will tell you this. We have no husbands. We have no suitors. We have only him, and the isolation he has created. I do not ask you to understand, only to know that what you suspect is true. My sisters and I are prisoners, not by lock and chain, but by circumstance, by distance, by the laws that make us his property. If you are a man of conscience, you will find a way to help us. But know that we cannot help ourselves. We have nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and he has made certain we understand that speaking against him would mean our destruction. R.H. Hayes read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling. Ruth Hargrove, the eldest daughter, had managed to communicate the truth while simultaneously explaining why that truth would be nearly impossible to act upon. She and her sisters were trapped not by physical restraints, but by the invisible bonds of isolation, economic dependence, and the legal reality that gave their father almost unlimited authority over them. The doctor immediately took the letter to Sheriff Prescott, but the lawman's response was predictably cautious. "This letter ain't signed, Doc. And even if it was, it don't constitute a formal complaint. It's just, well, it's suggestions and implications. I can't arrest a man for implications. Sheriff, this is clearly a cry for help," Hayes insisted. "Maybe so," Prescott acknowledged. "But from a legal standpoint, I got nothing to work with. The daughters are legally under their father's authority. They ain't married, so they got no husbands to advocate for them. And this letter, heartbreaking as it may be, don't name any specific crime." Texas law in 1854 offered virtually no protections for women in such circumstances. Daughters were considered under their father's authority until marriage. The concept of domestic crimes being subject to public prosecution was still decades away from common acceptance. And the specific crime that Hayes and Ruth Hargrove were dancing around in their communications was almost never prosecuted, especially when it occurred within families and in such isolated circumstances. Hayes refused to let the matter drop. He began making discreet inquiries among the few longtime residents of the area who might know something about the Hargrove family. What he learned painted a disturbing picture of progressive isolation and control. A merchant named Herman Fisher, who had been in Fredericksburg since 1846, remembered the early days of the Hargrove family. When they first came, Martha Hargrove would sometimes come to town with her husband, Fisher recalled. She was a quiet woman, very proper, but you could see the strain in her face. After each daughter was born, she became more withdrawn. By the time of her death in 1949, she hadn't been to town in more than a year. Fisher also remembered something else. In the months before Martha's death, there had been an incident. One of the older daughters, must have been about 14 then, came to town with her mother. Ruth, I think her name was. Some of the local boys showed interest in her. Nothing improper, just young men noticing a pretty girl. Josiah heard about it somehow. He came to my store in a fury, bought extra supplies, and announced he was building a wall. Not a literal wall, but he made it clear his family would have no more contact with outsiders than absolutely necessary. That was the last time I saw Martha, or any of the daughters in town. Another long-time resident, a widow named Mrs. Clara Vogel, recalled meeting Martha Hargrove at a church service in 1848. "She had that look," Vogel said, "the look of a woman who has stopped fighting, who has accepted her fate. When I tried to speak with her about the isolation she and her daughters faced, she just smiled sadly and said, 'We must submit to the authority God has placed over us.'" Those exact words. I've never forgotten them because they sounded so rehearsed, as if she'd been taught what to say. These accounts confirmed what Hayes suspected. The isolation had been deliberate, progressive, and designed to cut the Hargrove daughters off from any outside contact or influence. By 1854, they had been living in near-complete seclusion for almost 5 years, their entire world reduced to their father and the 800 acres he controlled. As spring turned to summer, Hayes wrestled with the moral and practical implications of the situation. He had taken an oath to do no harm, but he had also witnessed what appeared to be ongoing harm that he was powerless to stop. The law offered no remedy. The church, while sympathetic, had no jurisdiction over a family that didn't attend services, and the daughters themselves, however much they might suffer, were legally and practically unable to advocate for their own freedom. The situation might have remained in this terrible stalemate, but in July of 1854, events took a dramatic turn. Two of the Hargrove daughters, Ruth and Naomi, the two eldest, went into labor within days of each other. Josiah sent Diego Fuentes to summon Dr. Hayes once again, and this time, the doctor arrived determined to do more than just provide medical care. Dr. Hayes arrived at the Hargrove Ranch on July 18, 1854, accompanied by a midwife named Elizabeth Chambers, a widow with decades of experience whom he'd insisted on bringing. Josiah had initially objected to the additional presence, but Hayes had been firm. The births of two children within days requires more than one pair of hands. Mrs. Chambers is discreet and professional. She comes or I do not. Reluctantly, Josiah had agreed, and so Hayes and Chambers rode together to the isolated ranch, arriving in late afternoon. The limestone house seemed even more oppressive than Hayes remembered, windows still shuttered, an unnatural quiet pervading everything. Ruth was already in active labor when they arrived, and Naomi's contractions had begun that morning. Hayes and Chambers were shown to separate rooms where the two women lay. What happened over the next 12 hours would provide crucial evidence of the truth, evidence that neither Josiah nor his daughters could fully conceal. Mrs. Chambers, an observant and intelligent woman, noticed things that Hayes, as a male physician, might have missed. She saw the way the younger daughters moved around the house, silent, obedient, never making eye contact with their father. She noted the locks on the outside of the upstairs bedrooms. She observed that none of the daughters wore shoes, despite the rough stone floors, and realized this was a deliberate choice by Josiah. Makes it harder for them to run, she would later testify. But the most damning evidence came during the births themselves. Ruth's labor was difficult, lasting nearly 14 hours. During the worst of the pain, as women often do in extremis, she spoke without filter, crying out for her mother, asking God why he had forsaken them, and once in a moment of agony screaming, "No more, Father, please no more." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Hayes, attending to Ruth, looked at Mrs. Chambers, and both understood the full horror of what they were witnessing. The formal term, Father, could be interpreted as a prayer to God, but in context, with Ruth's eyes fixed on the door where Josiah stood waiting, the meaning was unmistakable. Naomi's birth, which followed early the next morning, was easier physically but more revealing emotionally. When the child was born, a daughter, Naomi wept not with joy but with something that sounded like despair. "Another girl," she whispered. "He'll be disappointed it's another girl." Mrs. Chambers, overcome with the moral urgency of the situation, did something unprecedented. She questioned Naomi directly, despite Josiah's presence in the hallway. "Child, who is the father of this baby?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Naomi looked toward the door, toward where Josiah stood listening, and her answer was carefully constructed. "The father is the man who rules this house," she said. Then, meeting Mrs. Chambers' eyes with a look of profound sadness, she added, "I have known no other man." It was a statement that could be interpreted multiple ways, designed to satisfy Josiah's demand for silence, while still communicating the truth to those who had ears to hear. Hayes and Chambers both understood. These women had been isolated for so long that they had never had the opportunity to know any other men. The implications were inescapable. Before leaving the ranch, Hayes examined the 5 remaining pregnant daughters. All were progressing toward their own deliveries in the coming months. He tried to speak privately with each, but Josiah hovered constantly, his presence a silent threat that made meaningful communication impossible. Yet even in their brief exchanges, Hayes gathered information. These young women had been systematically isolated, controlled, and conditioned to accept their situation as normal, even inevitable. The ride back to Fredericksburg was conducted in heavy silence. Finally, Mrs. Chambers spoke. Dr. Hayes, in 40 years of attending births, I have never seen anything like this. Those girls are prisoners, and what's being done to them?" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Hayes said quietly. "I've suspected since my first visit. But suspicion isn't proof, and even with proof, the law here is weak." "Then we must make it strong," Chambers replied. "We must do something." Upon returning to Fredericksburg, Hayes and Chambers went directly to Sheriff Prescott and laid out everything they had witnessed. The sheriff, a practical man uncomfortable with the situation but constrained by legal realities, listened to their account and then explained the harsh truth. "Legally, I can't do much," he said. "Those women would have to make formal complaints, and you've seen they're too frightened to do so. The father is within his legal rights to isolate his family on his property. As for the other matter, without testimony from the victims, it's their word against his, and he's the legal head of household." "But surely the circumstances," Hayes began. "Are troubling, yes," Prescott interrupted, "but not illegal in the eyes of Texas law as it currently stands. A man can discipline his household as he sees fit. He can restrict his daughter's movements. He can forbid them from marrying if he chooses. These are seen as paternal rights, Doctor." Mrs. Chambers's eyes blazed with anger. "And what of their rights, Sheriff? What of their humanity?" Prescott looked uncomfortable, but stood his ground. "Ma'am, I don't disagree with your sentiment, but I'm an officer of the law, not a philosopher. I enforce the laws as written, not as I might wish them to be." The conversation reached an impasse, but Hayes refused to give up. He spent the following days consulting with every authority figure he could find: ministers, merchants, even the few lawyers practicing in the region. The response was uniformly sympathetic but unhelpful. Everyone agreed the situation was terrible, but no one could identify a clear legal path to intervention. Then, in early August, an unexpected ally emerged. A young attorney named Benjamin Yates had recently arrived in Fredericksburg from Austin, where he'd been studying under one of Texas's few progressive legal scholars. Yates had heard rumors of the Hargrove case, and he approached Dr. Hayes with an idea. "The law, as currently written, may not protect those women," Yates explained, "but there's a principle in common law called parens patriae, the state's right to intervene on behalf of those who cannot protect themselves. It's rarely invoked, especially in Texas, but there is precedent. If we could convince a judge that those women are being held against their will in conditions that constitute imprisonment, we might be able to obtain a writ of habeas corpus." It was a long shot, requiring creative legal interpretation and a sympathetic judge. But it was something, a potential avenue where before there had been none. Yates drafted a petition, and Hayes and Mrs. Chambers signed affidavits describing what they had witnessed. The documents were presented to Judge Thomas Kerrigan, the circuit judge who rode through the region hearing cases. Judge Kerrigan was an older man, conservative in temperament, but known for his independence. He read the petition carefully, asked pointed questions, and then surprised everyone by agreeing to issue a preliminary order. "I will not issue a full writ without more information," he said, "but I will authorize Sheriff Prescott to conduct a welfare check on the Hargrove daughters, and I will authorize Attorney Yates to accompany him to ensure the daughters understand their legal rights." It was more than Hayes had dared hope for. On August 15, 1854, Sheriff Prescott, Attorney Yates, Dr. Hayes, and Mrs. Chambers rode out to the Hargrove Ranch, armed with Judge Kerrigan's order and a determination to finally break through the wall of silence that had protected Josiah Hargrove's secrets for so long. What they found when they arrived would shock them all and set in motion the events that would finally bring the truth to light. The Hargrove Ranch appeared different when the official party arrived on that August afternoon. The shutters stood open for the first time in Hayes's experience, and smoke rose from the chimney despite the summer heat. As they dismounted, Josiah emerged onto the porch, and his demeanor had changed dramatically from Hayes's previous visits. "Sheriff Prescott," Josiah said, his voice calm and almost welcoming. "I had a feeling you'd come eventually." Dr. Hayes couldn't keep his suspicions to himself, could he? There was no anger in his tone, only a strange resignation that put everyone immediately on edge. Prescott unfolded Judge Kerrigan's order and read it aloud. Authorization to enter the premises, speak with the daughters privately, and ensure they were not being held against their will. Josiah listened without interruption, then simply stepped aside. Of course, Sheriff. I have nothing to hide. My daughters are in the main room. You'll find them, prepared to speak with you. The phrasing was odd, and as the group entered the house, they understood why. All 7 daughters sat in a row on wooden benches in the main living area. Ruth and Naomi each held their newborn infants. The other 5, all visibly pregnant at various stages, sat with hands folded in their laps, eyes downcast. They wore matching simple dresses and their hair was braided identically. They looked less like individuals than like a collection of similar dolls arranged for display. Sheriff Prescott cleared his throat. Ladies, I need to speak with each of you individually. Judge Kerrigan has authorized me to ensure you're here of your own free will and that you understand your legal rights. Silence greeted his announcement. Not one daughter looked up. Ruth Hargrove, Prescott said, addressing the eldest, as the firstborn, I'll start with you. Would you come speak with me privately? Ruth slowly stood, her newborn daughter cradled in her arms. She glanced once at Josiah, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then followed Prescott and Attorney Yates into an adjacent room. Dr. Hayes and Mrs. Chambers remained in the main room with the other daughters and Josiah, an uncomfortable tableau of watchful waiting. The interview lasted nearly 30 minutes. When Ruth emerged, her face was composed but pale, and she would not meet anyone's eyes as she returned to her seat. Prescott's expression revealed nothing, but Attorney Yates looked deeply troubled. One by one, each daughter was interviewed. Naomi, then Judith, then Esther, Deborah, Mary, and finally 15-year-old Sarah. Each interview lasted between 20 and 40 minutes. Each daughter emerged looking pale and shaken, but maintaining the same careful composure. During these interviews, an extraordinary tension filled the main room. Mrs. Chambers, sitting near the younger daughters while they waited their turn, attempted to make quiet conversation, asking simple questions about their daily routines, their health, whether they needed anything. But every attempt at conversation was met with monosyllables or silence, and she noticed that before answering even the most innocuous question, each daughter's eyes would flick toward Josiah as if seeking permission. Finally, after more than 4 hours, all the interviews were concluded. Sheriff Prescott gathered his group outside, out of earshot of the house, and delivered his findings with visible frustration. Every single one of them tells the same story, he said. They claim they're here voluntarily, that they're being well cared for, and that the pregnancies resulted from relationships with traveling workers, different men who've since moved on. They refuse to name these men, or provide any details that could be verified. It's obviously rehearsed, Attorney Yates interjected. They've been coached on what to say. The answers were too similar, too carefully constructed to avoid specific claims. I know that, Prescott snapped, then took a breath to compose himself. But coached or not, they've all stated clearly that they're here by choice and that they wish to remain. From a legal standpoint, my hands are tied. They're adults, or near enough, and they've all denied being imprisoned or abused. Did you ask them directly? Mrs. Chambers demanded. Did you ask if their father is the one who made them pregnant? Prescott's face darkened. I did. Each one denied it. Some became visibly distressed at the question, tears shaking, but all denied it firmly. Without their testimony, there's no case. Dr. Hayes felt despair settling over him like a heavy cloak. They had come so far, obtained judicial approval, brought the full weight of what little law existed in this frontier region, and still the wall of silence held. The daughters were too frightened, too conditioned, or perhaps too aware of their lack of options to break free, but Attorney Yates wasn't ready to concede defeat. Sheriff, I'd like to speak with the youngest Sarah, one more time. Alone, without her father anywhere nearby. Judge Kerrigan's order gives us that authority. Prescott looked doubtful, but shrugged. Won't hurt to try, though I don't know what you expect to accomplish. They returned to the house, and Yates made his request, to speak with Sarah once more, this time on the porch, away from her father and sisters. Josiah's composure cracked slightly. You've already spoken with her. This borders on harassment, attorney. And yet the order gives me the authority. Yates replied calmly. Sarah, would you please step outside with me? The 15-year-old girl stood slowly, and as she moved toward the door, something extraordinary happened. Ruth, the eldest sister, spoke for the first time since her interview. Sarah, remember what you're taught. Remember where your loyalty lies. It was meant to sound like sisterly advice, but the words had the quality of a threat, or perhaps a desperate warning. Sarah nodded slowly and followed Yates onto the porch. What transpired in the conversation that followed would later be described by Yates in testimony as the most heartbreaking and courageous act I have ever witnessed. At first, Sarah repeated the same story she'd told the sheriff. She was there voluntarily. The father of her child was a traveling worker. She wished to stay with her family. But Yates, drawing on insights he'd gained from speaking with the other sisters, tried a different approach. Sarah, he said gently, I'm not asking you to tell me what happened. I'm asking you what you want to happen. If you could choose any future, any life, what would it be? The question seemed to penetrate through the rehearsed responses. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. That's a cruel question, she whispered. What I want doesn't matter. It's never mattered. It matters to me, Yates insisted. It matters to the law. You're a citizen of Texas, Sarah, young as you are. You have rights. Rights? She laughed bitterly, a sound no 15-year-old should make. I have the right to obey. I have the right to accept. I have the right to survive. Those are the only rights that matter here. What if there was somewhere else? Yates pressed. What if I could promise you safety, shelter, a life where you could make your own choices? For a long moment, Sarah stared at him, war visible in her expression. Hope fought with fear, desperation with resignation. Finally, in a voice barely audible, she said, Could you promise the same for my sisters, all of them? I can try, Yates said honestly. But I need your help. I need you to tell the truth. Sarah looked back through the window at the room where her father and sisters waited. Her hands moved unconsciously to her pregnant belly, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady despite her tears. The truth won't set us free, she said. The truth will destroy us. We have nowhere to go, no skills, no money. We'd be ruined, marked as shameful. Society would see us as accomplices, not victims. Our father knows this. He's told us over and over. The world outside is cruel to women like us. Our only choice is to endure and to survive in the only way available to us. But, Yates began. No, Sarah interrupted, and now steel entered her voice. I'll tell you what you want to know, but only if you promise to help all of us, not just me. I won't be saved alone. Either we all leave, or none of us do. It was an ultimatum that changed everything. Yates agreed immediately, though he had no idea how he could fulfill such a promise. And then, in halting, tearful sentences, 15-year-old Sarah Hargrove told him the truth about life on the isolated ranch, about the progressive isolation after their mother's death, about the night several months ago when things changed forever, and about the terrible understanding that had settled over all the sisters. They were trapped in a nightmare with no visible escape. When the conversation ended, Yates walked back into the house past Josiah, past the row of silent sisters, and directly to Sheriff Prescott. We need to arrest him now, he said quietly. I have testimony. The arrest of Josiah Hargrove on August 15, 1854, was conducted without violence but with palpable tension. Sheriff Prescott, armed with Sarah's testimony and supported by the authority of Judge Kerrigan's order, placed Josiah in restraints while the daughters watched in shocked silence. Josiah himself seemed almost relieved, a curious response that Dr. Hayes noted in his journal. He smiled when the shackles were locked. as if he'd been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. As the sheriff led Josiah toward his horse, the patriarch turned back to face his daughters one final time. His words, spoken calmly and with disturbing certainty, would haunt those present for years to come. "You'll see," he said, his eyes moving from one daughter to the next. "The world will not embrace you as you think. They'll judge you more harshly than they judge me. I protected you from that judgment. Now you'll face it alone." The ride back to Fredericksburg took 4 hours, and during that journey Josiah spoke only once. Sheriff Prescott later recounted the conversation to Dr. Hayes and Attorney Yates. "He asked me if I had daughters. I told him I had 2, both young. He smiled at that. Not a cruel smile, but something almost pitying. He said, 'Then you understand. Everything we do to protect them. The methods may differ, Sheriff, but the love is the same.' I nearly struck him then. The man genuinely believes he acted out of love." Back at the Hargrove Ranch, the reality of their new situation began to settle over the sisters like a heavy fog. Mrs. Chambers, ever practical, stayed the night along with Dr. Hayes, helping to organize immediate necessities. But as darkness fell, a troubling pattern emerged. The daughters seemed paralyzed by their newfound freedom, unable to make even simple decisions without seeking approval that was no longer there. "Should we light more candles?" Mary asked, looking around as if expecting someone to answer. "Father always said to conserve them after sunset." "We can light as many as we need," Mrs. Chambers replied gently. "You're free to make that choice now." But Mary simply stood there, the unlit candle in her hand, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how," she whispered. "I don't know how to choose." It was Ruth who finally took charge, though her authority was tentative and uncertain. She began making lists of supplies needed, of tasks to be done, of questions that needed answering. Her organizational efforts revealed just how completely their father had controlled every aspect of their lives. They didn't know how much money existed, or where it was kept. They didn't know which cattle were theirs to sell, or how to go about selling them. They had never purchased supplies in town, never negotiated with merchants, never managed a household independently. That night, gathered in the main room with their infants and unborn children, the 7 sisters held their first truly private conversation in years. Dr. Hayes and Mrs. Chambers, respecting their need for privacy, retired to the porch but could hear fragments through the open windows. What they heard was heartbreaking in its complexity. "Are we doing the right thing?" Judith asked. "Testifying against him?" "What choice did we have?" Naomi replied, exhaustion evident in her voice. "Live like that forever? But what comes now?" Deborah's voice was small, frightened. "He was right about one thing. The world will judge us. They already do. Did you see how that merchant looked at us in town last month, like we were tainted?" Sarah, the youngest, spoke with surprising firmness. "He made us believe we had no choices, but we do, we always did. We were just too afraid and too isolated to see them." "And now?" Ruth asked. "What are our choices now? Truly?" The silence that followed was long and heavy. Finally, Esther spoke. "We survive. Together, we find a way to build something from this. We have to, for them." She gestured to the newborns sleeping nearby. "They deserve better than to grow up in shame." The next morning brought the first test of their new reality. 3 women from Fredericksburg arrived at the ranch, ostensibly to offer help, but clearly driven by curiosity. Mrs. Chambers intercepted them at the porch, and the conversation that followed revealed the complicated nature of the support the sisters could expect. "We've brought some preserves and bread," one woman said, her eyes constantly trying to peer past Mrs. Chambers into the house. "The poor dears must be in such a state. Is it true? All 7 of them?" "The Hargrove sisters are managing as well as can be expected," Mrs. Chambers replied coolly. "Your charity is appreciated, but I must ask that you respect their privacy during this difficult time." Of course," another woman said quickly. "We just want to help, though I must say the whole town is talking. Some are saying the girls must have, Well, that they must have encouraged it somehow. You know how men can be led astray. Mrs. Chambers's expression turned to ice. I know nothing of the sort. These young women are victims of a crime, not participants in sin. Anyone who suggests otherwise is welcome to take their charitable impulses elsewhere. The women left shortly after, chastened but undoubtedly ready to spread more gossip. It was a preview of what the sisters would face, a community torn between sympathy and scandal, wanting to help, but unable to fully separate the victims from the crimes committed against them. News of Josiah's arrest spread rapidly through Central Texas, and reactions varied wildly. Some saw it as justice long overdue. Others, particularly those who valued patriarchal authority and family privacy above all else, viewed the arrest as government overreach. A few vocal critics suggested the daughters had fabricated their accusations to seize control of their father's property. Attorney Yates found himself fielding questions and criticisms from all quarters. One afternoon, a week after the arrest, he was confronted in Fredericksburg's Main Street by a rancher named Caleb Thompson, who represented a particular strain of frontier thinking. "You're tearing apart a family based on the word of hysterical women," Thompson declared, his voice loud enough to draw a crowd. "A man's home is his castle, Yates. What happens within those walls is between him and God." "And what of the daughters' rights?" Yates replied evenly. "Do they not also have claims to justice and protection?" "Rights?" Thompson scoffed. "They're unmarried women living under their father's roof. He has authority over them by law and by nature. You're setting a dangerous precedent. Next, any daughter who doesn't like her father's rules can have him arrested." "This isn't about household rules," Yates said firmly. "This is about crimes that violate both law and basic human decency. The evidence will speak for itself at trial." But Thompson's words reflected a real concern among some of the community. If fathers could be arrested for what happened within their families, where would it end? The case was forcing uncomfortable questions about the limits of parental authority, questions that many preferred not to ask. Meanwhile, in the county jail, Josiah Hargrove settled into his confinement with the same eerie calm he'd displayed during his arrest. The jailer, a man named Otto Becker, reported that Josiah spent hours each day reading his Bible and writing in a journal. He ate little, slept less, and occasionally could be heard praying, though whether in repentance or continued justification, no one could say. Dr. Hayes visited Josiah once, driven by a physician's curiosity about the man's mental state. The conversation was brief but illuminating. Josiah showed no signs of the madness one might expect. He was lucid, articulate, and frighteningly rational in his twisted worldview. "You think you've saved them," Josiah said calmly, "but you've condemned them to lives of shame and hardship. No man will marry them now. They'll be whispered about, pointed at, forever marked. I gave them shelter from that cruelty. I kept them safe." "Safe?" Hayes couldn't keep the anger from his voice. "You imprisoned them. You violated them. You stole their futures." "I gave them the only future they could have," Josiah countered. "A world that judges women so harshly left me no choice but to keep them apart from it. Everything I did was to protect them from a society that would have used them and discarded them." It was a defense that would horrify the court, but it revealed the depths of Josiah's self-deception. He had genuinely convinced himself that his actions were protective rather than predatory. That isolation and control were forms of love rather than abuse. As August turned to September, the sisters began the painful process of preparing for the trial. Attorney Yates met with each of them multiple times, explaining what testimony would be required and preparing them for the ordeal of public examination. The prospect terrified them almost as much as their father's control had. "Everyone will know," Naomi said during one preparation session, her hands twisting in her lap. "Everyone will hear the details. How can we live with that? The alternative is to let him go unpunished." Yates replied gently, "Is that what you want?" "I want to disappear," Naomi whispered. "I want none of this to have happened. But since I can't have that, I want—" She paused, searching for words. I want other daughters to be spared what we endured. If our testimony can help achieve that, then perhaps some good can come from this horror." It was a sentiment echoed by her sisters, a determination born not from vengeance, but from a desire to ensure their suffering might prevent future suffering. They would testify not just to convict their father, but to bear witness to a crime that society too often preferred to ignore. The preliminary hearing for Josiah Hargrove was held on August 30th. Judge Kerrigan presided, and Attorney Yates presented the case. The charges were serious and unprecedented. Multiple counts of what the law awkwardly termed carnal knowledge of a female relation, a crime that existed in Texas law but was rarely prosecuted. The hearing room was packed with curious onlookers from across the region. The Hargrove case had become the scandal of the decade, whispered about in every town and trading post. But Judge Kerrigan, conscious of the daughter's privacy and dignity, ordered the hearing closed to the public after the initial proceedings. Sarah Hargrove testified first, the weight of representing her sisters evident in her pale face and trembling hands. With Attorney Yates's gentle guidance, she described life after their mother's death, the increasing isolation, the night their father had first come to Ruth's room, and the terrible understanding that had gradually dawned on all the sisters. They were alone, miles from help, legally under their father's authority, and too terrified and isolated to seek assistance. "He told us it was our duty," Sarah testified, her voice barely audible. "He said that we were his property by law and by scripture, that God had placed him over us, and that what happened within his household was no one else's concern. He said if we ever told anyone, we would be cast out, and would die alone and destitute, that no one would believe us, and that society would blame us for tempting him." Cross-examination by Josiah's appointed defense attorney, a reluctant local lawyer named Marcus Webb, was brief. Webb had little stomach for defending such actions, but was professionally obligated. His questions focused on trying to establish doubt about whether the acts had been forced, a common defense strategy that essentially blamed the victims. "Miss Hargrove," Webb asked, "did your father physically restrain you?" "He didn't need to," Sarah replied. "Where would I go?" "I was 15 years old, miles from anywhere, with no money, no education beyond what he taught me, and no knowledge of the world. He controlled everything, our food, our shelter, our very survival." Ruth testified next, then Naomi, each adding details that built an overwhelming case. The other sisters provided written statements, too distressed to testify in person. Throughout it all, Josiah sat silently, his face impassive, showing neither remorse nor defiance. When Judge Kerrigan asked if he had anything to say in his defense, Josiah finally spoke, and his words revealed the twisted logic that had justified his actions. "I loved my daughters," he said. "Everything I did was to protect them from a corrupt world. I kept them safe, fed them, clothed them. I raised them to be righteous. Yes, I exercised my authority over them, as is my right as their father and as the head of my household. The world outside is full of dangers for young women. I kept them from those dangers. They will never be abandoned, never face the cruelties that other women endure at the hands of careless husbands. My daughters will always be under my protection." It was a defense that had no legal merit, but perhaps reflected genuinely how Josiah saw his actions, not as crimes, but as extreme patriarchal authority exercised for what he considered protective purposes. Judge Kerrigan listened impassively, then rendered his decision. "Mr. Hargrove, you will stand trial for multiple counts of unlawful carnal knowledge. Bail is denied. You will remain in custody until trial." The trial itself, held in October 1854, was swift by the standards of the era. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony consistent, and the physical proof, 7 pregnant or recently delivered daughters, irrefutable. The defense could offer no meaningful counter-narrative. On October 24, 1854, a jury of 12 men deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Kerrigan's sentencing statement, recorded in the court archives, reflected both the horror of the crimes and the legal limitations of the era. Josiah Hargrove, you have been found guilty of crimes that defy the basic bounds of human decency and parental duty. The law provides for punishment, but no punishment can undo what has been done or restore to your daughters what you have stolen from them. I sentence you to 20 years imprisonment at hard labor in the state penitentiary. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none. It was one of the harshest sentences handed down in Texas up to that time for such crimes, reflecting the extreme nature of the case and the judge's personal outrage. Josiah was transported to the Huntsville State Prison, where records show he served 13 years before dying of pneumonia in 1867. But the resolution of Josiah's fate did little to resolve the fate of his daughters, who now faced the challenge of building lives from the wreckage he had created. The months following Josiah's conviction were perhaps the most challenging for the Hargrove daughters, who found themselves free but utterly unprepared for that freedom. Mrs. Chambers became their primary advocate and protector, organizing a small network of women who helped the sisters through their remaining pregnancies and early motherhood. Between August and December 1854, 5 more babies were born to the Hargrove sisters. In total, the 7 women gave birth to 9 children, 6 daughters and 3 sons. The irony was not lost on observers that Josiah, who had so desperately wanted sons, had created this nightmare that resulted in mostly daughters. Finding permanent solutions for the sisters proved extraordinarily difficult. The stigma attached to them was severe, despite the fact that they were clearly victims. Several charitable organizations in the larger Texas cities were approached, but most declined to help, citing the scandalous nature of the case. The attitude of the time, even among well-meaning people, was that the sisters were tainted by what had happened to them. The resolution came through an unlikely combination of sources. Father Brandt and the Lutheran congregation purchased a small farmstead about 10 miles from Fredericksburg, placing it in trust for the sisters. Dr. Hayes contributed medical care for years without charge and helped the older sisters learn midwifery, giving them a profession. Mrs. Chambers taught them skills for supporting themselves, sewing, cooking for sale, eventually even reading and mathematics beyond what their father had permitted. Most remarkably, 2 of the sisters eventually married. In 1857, Ruth married a widower named Heinrich Kruger, a German immigrant who had lost his wife to cholera and had 3 children of his own. Kruger, a deeply religious but pragmatic man, understood that Ruth's daughter was not the result of sin on her part. The marriage was controversial, but ultimately accepted by the small community that had grown around the sisters. In 1859, Esther married a ranch hand named James Butler, a quiet man who had worked on neighboring properties and had come to know Esther through church. Their marriage, too, faced initial resistance, but gradually became accepted. The other 5 sisters never married, but created a life together on their small farm, raising their children collectively and supporting themselves through midwifery, sewing, and eventually taking in laundry from the surrounding community. It was not an easy life, but by the standards of the time, they achieved a remarkable degree of independence and dignity. Dr. Samuel Hayes continued to document the sisters' progress in his journal for years. His final entry about them, written in 1872, reflects both satisfaction and sadness. I saw Ruth today in town, accompanied by her husband and 4 of her 5 children, the youngest daughter from before, and 3 more born to her marriage. She looked well, healthy, her eyes clear. We spoke briefly, and she thanked me for my intervention so many years ago. But there was a shadow in her expression that will never fully lift, a wariness born of experiences no one should endure. The other sisters are similarly marked. They function, they survive, they even occasionally smile, but they were robbed of something fundamental: innocence, security, trust. No verdict, no sentence could ever fully restore what their father stole from them. The 9 children born from Josiah's crimes grew up knowing the truth of their origins. It would have been impossible to hide in such a small community. Several moved away as adults, seeking lives free from the shadow of their unusual births. Others remained in the area, accepted by a community that gradually learned to see them as individuals rather than symbols of their grandfather's sins. The Hargrove case had lasting effects on Texas law, though not immediately. In the years following, advocates pointed to the case when arguing for strengthened laws protecting women and children from domestic crimes. It would take decades, but gradually, the legal understanding of parental authority evolved to recognize that such authority had limits, and that the state had an obligation to protect the vulnerable even within families. The ranch itself, the isolated property where so much suffering occurred, was eventually sold to pay legal fees and debts. The limestone house stood empty for years, avoided by locals who knew its history. In 1883, it burned in a grass fire, and no one attempted to rebuild. Today, only foundation stones remain, barely visible among the cedar and oak. In 1889, 35 years after the events, a newspaper reporter tried to interview Ruth Hargrove Kruger about her experiences for what he called a historical account. She declined firmly, saying only, "Some stories need to be remembered so they can't happen again. But the people in those stories deserve to be more than their worst moments. My sisters and I survived. We built lives. That's what matters now." She died in 1903, at the age of 77, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who knew her as a strong, dignified woman who had overcome tremendous hardship. Her sisters lived similar long lives, outlasting their father by decades and creating families and futures he had tried to deny them. The last surviving Hargrove sister, Sarah, the youngest, who had broken the silence at age 15, died in 1918 at 84 years old. In her later years, she had become something of a quiet advocate for women's rights, speaking occasionally at church gatherings about the importance of education and independence for women. She never discussed her own experiences publicly, but those who knew her story understood the weight behind her words when she said, "A woman must never be so isolated that she cannot seek help. A woman must never be so dependent that she cannot leave. These are not luxuries. These are necessities of survival." The case of the Hargrove family remains one of the most disturbing episodes in Texas frontier history, a reminder of how isolation and unchecked authority could enable terrible crimes. But it's also a story of survival, of women who found the courage to break silence, and of a community that, however imperfectly, eventually chose to help rather than judge. What do you think of this story? Does it make you reflect on how much has changed and how much still needs to change in protecting the vulnerable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this historical account moved you or made you think, please share this video with others who appreciate true stories from our past. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to see more forgotten histories that deserve to be remembered. These stories matter, and your engagement helps ensure they're never forgotten again. Until next time, remember that the past shapes our present, and understanding it helps build a better future.